Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. My name is Samira, and I am a patient living with a rare autoimmune disease called neuromyelitis optica, for short, NMOSD. I live in Boston, and I was diagnosed 8.5 years ago. 2 months after I got diagnosed, I started the Samira Foundation, which is now a global organization dedicated to raising awareness of NMOSD and MOGAD. We fundraise to support research. We're passionate about building communities of support for patients and their caregivers and patient advocacy. Excuse me. Today, it is my honor and pleasure to moderate a session titled Relationships in Autoimmune Disease, in which I will be speaking with Barbara and Mark, who will introduce themselves in a second. But just before we get started, relationships are such a core part of our lives, whether you have illness or not. So when you add the complexity of illness and that to a rare disease or an autoimmune disease, how does that impact and affect the dynamics of the variety of relationships that we have in our lives? They could be romantic relationships, relationships with our families, our friends, professional relationships. The spectrum is so wide. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Barbara and Mark. Barbara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Samira. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. I am what's called a patient advocate. And what that means is that I represent the voices of patients and caregivers at various healthcare environments like Sutter Health in Northern California, Patient and Family Centered Care Partners, the Well Spouse Organization, and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And I'm also a researcher and author of a book called Love in the Time of Chronic Illness: How to Fight the Sickness, Not Each Other. And I'll share a little bit more about our research in a few minutes. Mark?
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And thanks, everyone, for being here today. Very honored to be here with such an esteemed panel. So my name is Mark Yale, and I am the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation Advocacy and Research Coordinator. And I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune blistering skin disease in 2007. And after that, I became connected with the advocacy group, the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation, or what we like to call the IPPF for short. Everybody's got their acronyms, that's ours. And just really wanted to connect with other patients so that I didn't feel alone, but also wanted to help other patients so that they didn't necessarily have to experience the challenges that I experienced with my disease. So I became a peer health coach and started that program at the IPPF, and really tried to help other patients with the disease, become knowledgeable, understand more about their disease, and also to become advocates and be able to advocate for themselves. As Samira said, I mean, this is, having a disease, an autoimmune disease, can be very challenging. And, I was a young person with a family, and, so those relationships were definitely strained, during that time. So, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So just excited to be on the panel, and thanks for having me. Samira, I think you're on mute.
I can't hear you, Samira.
Oh, you would think 2.5 years into the pandemic, I would understand how to use these things, but I don't. All right. So why don't we get started? Thank you both for introducing yourself. Truly an honor to be on this panel with you. And I just want to say, I do have Barbara's book here. So it's Love in the Time of Chronic Illness: How to Fight the Sickness, Not Each Other. I have yet to read it, but I'm actually going to take it on my flight with me tonight, Barbara. So hopefully I can finish it. But we'll start with you since I have your book in my hand. Can you share with our audience some of the core learnings of your research that you came across when writing your book?
Thank you. And I hope it's a night flight and the book will put you to sleep. A colleague of mine and I, we wrote this book because we were both the ill partners in our relationship. in 2000, I came down with a mysterious, horrible chronic pain condition that took a very long time and seeing a lot of specialists to get a handle on. And during that period, some people thought it had immune uh, immune system influences, but nobody could really come up with a name for it. Um, and so my colleague who had a stroke, we wrote the book that we wished we had during our illness experiences. And it's a book that explores the impact of illness on the relationship between the patient and caregiver. Because, as Mark said, and Sumaira, as many of us know, illness can often become the third partner in the relationship. And we wanted to learn how to maintain and even strengthen the relationship throughout all the upheavals of illness. So we interviewed many, many couples, surviving partners, and experts from different disciplines, medical, research, spirituality. And while the book focuses on couples, we have learned that there are 4 basic patterns that seem to emerge when illness enters the picture and affects that relationship between patient and caregiver, whether you're spouses or siblings or an adult child and an older parent. So if you could put up the slide, Dan, please. Those 4 patterns. The first one we call love grows. This was the biggest surprise to me. How many people said to us that they felt a closeness that they would not have ever believed possible had it not been for the presence of the illness in their lives. They said things like, there is nothing quite like illness to shine a light on what really matters and what doesn't matter, and to take you down to the bedrock of your relationships, where many people, and that was the surprise, how many, of course not all, but many, found a deep reservoir of love and compassion for each other and for themselves. Another pattern we saw was what we call carry the load. There are an abundance of chores to be done to manage a household, a job, a family, and an illness. And the patient's ability to participate as a full partner in carrying the load waxes and wanes depending on the illness. So sometimes it can be a slippery slope to becoming passive patient and overactive caregiver. And a key factor is being deliberate about rebalancing the load as circumstances change. Another pattern we saw is what we called connection or collision. The ill person, I mean, this is kind of obvious, and we all know it, but we don't consciously necessarily appreciate it. The ill person and the caregiver are each experiencing the illness differently through their own perspectives, their own needs, and their own histories. And they may not need from each other the same thing at the same time. For example, the ill person may need some alone time just to cope with what's going on in their body, while the caregiver may need to have contact with the ill person to make sure that they're okay. The key is to have clear communication about what you need so that even when you need different things, you can still connect rather than collide. One more pattern we saw, which we called secrets or communication. So I think we all know that illness stirs up a whirlpool of emotions. And while they are all completely legitimate, some may feel negative or even harsh. For example, the ill partner may be angry that the caregiver still gets to be as active as they like in life. The well partner may be angry at the ill partner for having an illness. And they may each be grieving in silence separately for the ways illness has changed their lives. These are all completely normal reactions, but they often remain unspoken. But not speaking about them doesn't make them go away. They just go underground, and they tend to emerge in more slippery and unproductive ways. So the key is to make space for speaking the truth, which, with as much love and compassion and empathy as possible. So those are four primary patterns that seem to exist across different illnesses and across different kinds of patient and caregiver relationships. And there are others that we go into in the book, but these are ones I think that most of us here um, can recognize.
Wow, thank you. That's really deep. And I'm sure there are going to be things in your book that I learn as I turn the pages. Thank you for sharing that, Barbara. You know, it's funny when I was asked to moderate this panel, I kind of chuckled to myself because as a single 33-year-old woman, I'm like, what do I know about relationships and autoimmunity? I don't have a boyfriend, I'm not married, and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, it of course goes so far beyond just romantic relationships. I reflect on the last 8.5 years of my life with illness and the plethora of relationships that have come and gone, have strengthened, have weakened over the years. And one thing I can say for sure is that, you know, when you face illness, when you face adversity in your life, these are the moments when you really realize who is there for you and who, will be there to support you through thick and thin. And so, that sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. There were relationships that disappeared from my life after illness that were shocking to me, that were hurtful to me. But then there were relationships that came about from illness that were incredibly surprising and wonderful. So it really is just a very wide spectrum, which is a great segue to our next question, which, Mark, I will ask you. How has illness impacted your relationships with key people in your life? And I understand you have children, right? So I'd love
Yeah.
to hear about how illness has impacted your interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, I think Samara, you're right on the money. When you become ill, you really find out like who's going to be there for you. Whether it's family or even your friends, and you really discover, who are those key people in your life that you are going to continue to build and expand your relationships with. And as you mentioned, yeah, I have a wife who was extremely supportive during the early days and continues to be, and certainly I couldn't do this without her, as well as my children. And I'm very fortunate. I have three daughters who worship and admire their father, thank goodness. And interestingly, when I became ill or after I was diagnosed, they were all at very different ages and stages in their life. So I had a daughter in middle school and another one in elementary or primary school, and then one that was just 5 years old. And they each experienced the disease differently. I had one daughter that was very supportive, another that was very much in denial that her father was even sick, and then the youngest one didn't even understand why I was sick and why was I going to the doctor so often, and even developed a compulsion to like wash her hands a lot because she didn't understand that what this illness meant and how it affected her. And of course, as to just kind of expand on what Barbara was mentioning, the themes that they saw, that family and friend relationship, continues to develop and continues to grow. And one thing I noticed, particularly with my wife, was, we had a huge change in roles and responsibilities in our life. That carrying of the load shifted immensely. So I went from being the main breadwinner to being, disabled and being at home. And so my wife had to go back to work, and she had to carry the load. And I was now the stay-at-home father, taking care of the children. So it was a complete role reversal, and all of those responsibilities changed. And with that comes stress and, animosity and, that connection and collision that Barbara was talking about. And so it's so important to make sure that you have that clear communication and understanding about what those roles and responsibilities are, who's going to do what, but also be able to share, as she mentioned, the those secrets or the communication. If you're feeling angry, or a lot of times I felt ashamed that I was sick because I was the main breadwinner and now I can't even get out of bed, um, or just being sad. It's important to be able to share those types of things. But I think in the end, what I really saw was, those relationships with my family and my very close friends became much stronger, because of the illness. And so, I always kind of look at it as, obviously I can look back now and say it was a silver lining. It was a blessing in disguise that I became ill, because it really helped me realize what was important in my life.
Wow. Well, you gave us a lot to think about there, Mark, and so happy to hear that you have such support around you. And girls are the best, by the way. Daughters are the best. We just have a different level of care, I think, just inherently. But thank you, Mark. Barbara, I guess I'll ask you the same question. You wrote an entire book on it. So how has illness impacted your relationships with the key people in your life?
Um, I'll talk about how it affected my relationship with my husband, but first I just want to thank Mark for sharing so articulately and so authentically about the many, many ways in which illness changed and continues to change, and how adept you are. And it sounds like you and your family and your kids have learned how to dance with each other around the rhythms of illness. Thank you for sharing that. So, as I said earlier, I got whacked with this mysterious chronic pain condition. And it started in 2000, and it just totally knocked me out of life. I couldn't work, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't leave the house. I spent my time crying and pacing and trying to get just one micro step ahead of the pain. And I became completely dependent on my heroic husband as my interface with the world and as my emotional savior. I also became completely dependent on my dog. For those of you who have pets, I mean, how that unconditional love sometimes gets through when humans just don't know what to say. But that was a tumultuous upheaval, similar to the one that Mark described, when he went from breadwinner to house dad. And I was used to being a power in the world, and I just became a sobbing, sloppy mess, on the floor in the living room. Luckily, though, while illness changed everything for the worst, it also changed it for the best. It took away everything except our bedrock. And luckily, when Richard and I turned to each other, because that's all that was left in my world, and in his world, really, we found a profound love for the other that often got muffled or compartmentalized by the noise of everyday life before illness. So for us, illness emphasized that our love was really the most important thing. Nothing mattered more than that. And illness also made our communications more truthful and more authentic, because we were both so exhausted, and neither one of us had the bandwidth, to obfuscate or to keep secrets. We only had the energy to say what really matters, or what was really funny. And that was the extent of it. So that was the main impact of illness on my relationship with my husband. And as you both said, you kind of learn who's going to stick by your side, who disappears, and who comes forward. But I would add to that when your people know that you're sick, most people do not know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to treat you. They don't know if it's intrusive if they ask questions. They don't know if they should give you space. So sometimes it could be helpful to literally give those people instructions, to be overt and deliberate about what you need and when you need it. And when you need space, say, not now. And when you want attention, say, hey, help me with this.
Exactly. So I think that perfectly encapsulates what we're going to talk about next, which is tools for managing relationships. And I think for me personally, it's been very important. Barbara, you just said it. People usually don't know how to help. They don't know how to respond, and they don't know what they don't know. And especially if you have an invisible illness, so it's not so visible to the eye that something is going on. And that's something that I struggled with for years in the beginning of my journey, because everything that was going on with me was happening on the inside, but from the outside, I looked perfectly normal. So it was very difficult for people to understand that I was experiencing something so devastating while being able to look and function perfectly normal on the outside. And something that helped me, especially in my earlier years, I was in my mid 20s where you don't really know anything about life. But something that really helped me was learning early on that I need to communicate what I want people to know about what I'm going through, because I can't expect people to be mind readers, especially when it's not visible to them that I am going through something. I also learned that being open, honest, and vulnerable was they were such effective tools in my toolbox, because this opened this channel of empathy and understanding between myself and whoever I was managing a relationship with. So that segues us into our final segment of our panel today, which is, what are some advice, learnings, and tools that you can share with our audience that have helped you manage your relationships in your life while living with chronic illness? And Mark, we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Samari. I mean, I agree with you 100%, especially dealing with, as you mentioned, that invisible illness. So, and I think a lot of patients with autoimmune disease experience that, because it's not always something that is apparent. And so, I think some of the strategies that I try to use, and that I recommend using, would, at least that helped me the most, was number one was just really to educate myself about the disease, so I knew how to communicate and how to articulate what I was experiencing with the disease. So really educate myself about the disease so I knew how to communicate that properly to my friends, to my family, to people that came up to me. Interestingly, it's kind of I have a kind of a funny story that I'll share, but part of my disease, including losing vision in one of my eyes. So people would look at me, and some people would be like, "Oh, what's wrong with your eye?" Or, why is your eye closed? But mostly, most adults and older folks didn't ask me that, but children always ask me that every single time, because they notice everything. So they'd always come up to me, even if I was a stranger. A child would come up to me and say, "What happened to your eye?" So I would always come up with an amusing story, like maybe I was a pirate or something and I lost my eye. I try to make it kind of fun. So, and that's another strategy is, you always have to be thinking about, yes, this is a negative thing that's happened to me, but, how can I turn it into a positive thing? How can I take something negative and turn it into a positive? The other thing that you mentioned, I think that's really important, is that self advocacy, being able to advocate for yourself, particularly with your doctors, your healthcare providers, but also with your friends and family. Say, hey, and Barbara mentioned this. It's okay to say, hey, I need this, or now's not the time. I can do this later. So really be able to advocate for yourself and know your boundaries. I put a lot of pressure on myself to be able to do things because I was very productive before I became ill. And then when I got ill, I wasn't as productive. So it took me a really long time to understand that if I can't do something today, it's okay. It'll still be there tomorrow. I don't have to put so much pressure on myself to do it now. Even for simple things like just doing the laundry or things like that. So really kind of understanding and knowing your boundaries, I think, is really important. And then, of course, just being able to communicate, take time, be deliberate, communicate how you're feeling, what your expectations are, because everybody has different expectations. But as long as everybody knows what everybody's expectations are, it can be smooth sailing from there on.
Thank you, Mark. I love that you brought up boundaries. That's something that I definitely need to incorporate more into my life.
We put so much pressure on ourselves, right? Just to get everything done, right? Yeah.
Part of being an empath, I think, is you just sometimes don't have boundaries. But thank you for sharing. And Barbara, we'll ask you the same question too. What are some tips, tricks, tools, learnings, advice you can share about relationship management?
Well, it's interesting to me that you both hit on what we learned from interviewing so many people for our book, the Love in the Time of Chronic Illness. You both named it. There are three things to help build that kind of relationship resilience to carry that heavy load of illness. And they are: be aware, be deliberate, and communicate. Be aware of how illness is affecting you and how it's affecting you both, and maybe affecting you both differently. And also be aware that the physical and the emotional impact of illness is going to change over time as conditions change. And that could be as the illness changes or as your life circumstances change. So to be aware, notice. So illness, it may wind up being the third partner, but it doesn't have to get to be the driver. And with that awareness, be deliberate about choosing how you will both behave, what choices you will make, what you need from each other. And don't slide, to the extent you can, don't just slide unconsciously into patterns that really might not be the best ones for you. Choose, talk about, discuss who will do what chores, who will do with insurance issues, how and if you will socialize, and very importantly, how you'll be with each other. And in order to do that, in order to be aware and to be deliberate, you have to communicate, big capital C. That's probably the most important one. And to the extent possible, having authentic conversations with each other about your feelings, your needs, your fears, and your hopes for the other and for yourself too, and for both of you together. And especially asking for help. So many people have such a hard time saying, I need help, please help me. But asking for help is actually a gift. It's a gift to yourself, and it's a gift to the other person. So asking for help and expressing appreciation in little ways and in big ways. And also know that communication doesn't have to be verbal. It can be about sitting in silence together, a certain touch or a certain look. I'll share that, kind of silly, but no matter how much pain I was in, my husband and I, every Sunday night at 9 o'clock, thank you HBO, we watched The Sopranos. no matter what was going on. And that was one way that we communicated our connection to each other. And I'll close by saying, at the end of the day, you pointed to this, Mark, getting that extra load of laundry done, or picking up the groceries, it's important, but it's not going to be remembered. And you may have heard this exquisite quote by the great activist and poet Maya Angelou. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel."
I'm glad that we're ending on such a high note. Thank you both for your vulnerability, for your experiences, your insight, and thank you to the live audience who joined in to listen to us discuss relationships and autoimmune disease. I hope you all have a very happy Friday and a lovely weekend. Thank you.